On a cold December night in the late 1970s, the parking lot of a brand new shopping mall in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, glowed under harsh yellow lights. It was just days before Christmas, the kind of evening when people hurried from store to store with bags in their hands and lists in their heads, thinking about presents and family, not about danger. One of those people was 18-year-old Michelle Martinko. Michelle was a senior at Kennedy High School, the kind of girl people remembered even decades later. She had long, feathered blonde hair that framed her face like something out of a Farrah Fawcett poster, clear blue eyes, and a smile that seemed to catch people off guard. Her friends remembered her as smart, kind, and almost completely unaware of how striking she really was. To them, she was just Michelle, a choir girl, a twirler, a decent student, and a miracle to her family. Her parents had not had an easy road to her. Her mother, Janet, had gone through multiple miscarriages before Michelle was born. When Michelle finally arrived, Janet was in her mid-40s. To the Martinko family, this little blonde girl was not just a daughter, she was a blessing they thought they might never have. Michelle grew up adored, photographed, fussed over. To her older sister Janelle, who was more than a decade ahead of her, Michelle was the surprise kid who had toddled down the aisle as a flower girl at her wedding. But Michelle's childhood was not simple. Around 12, she was diagnosed with scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. Doctors put her in a rigid brace that ran from her neck to her hips. It was bulky and unforgiving, nearly impossible to hide under clothes. For a young girl in middle school, it might as well have been a neon sign flashing different. She became self-conscious, withdrawn at times, painfully aware of how she looked. When the brace finally came off, around 14, everything shifted. The shy girl in the body brace turned into a teenager, figuring out who she was without it. Her hair grew long, blonde, and glamorous. Fashion became a language she spoke fluently. She loved stylish clothes and makeup. Boys noticed, men noticed. According to friends, Michelle did not always realize the effect she had on people. She was not arrogant. If anything, she was naive about how much attention she drew just by walking into a room. On the night that would change everything, December 19, 1979, Michelle was not supposed to be part of any crime story. She was supposed to be celebrating. Her high school concert choir was having a banquet at a local hotel. Michelle dressed up for the occasion. A dark dress, pantyhose, a nice coat, hair done just so. She spent the evening like any other teenage girl on a big night out, surrounded by friends, laughter echoing in banquet hall corners. After the banquet, a lot of kids drifted to the same place, Westdale Mall. Westdale had just opened that year. At about 2 months old, it was still shiny and exciting, the newest place to be in Cedar Rapids. It had department stores, a food court, and 1,000 places to people watch. For teenagers, it was as much a social hub as a shopping center. Michelle had business there. Her mother had put a winter coat on layaway, and Michelle was supposed to go and pay it off with money she had saved. She had about $180 in cash with her, a serious amount of money for a high school senior at the time. A friend later remembered telling her, half joking and half serious, to put the money away when she saw Michelle holding it out in the open. You do not flash that kind of cash in a crowded mall just before Christmas. Not if you are smart. And Michelle was smart. She tucked the money back into her purse. She bumped into people she knew, choir kids, mall employees, friends. Westdale felt safe, familiar. Even so, there were subtle hints that Michelle did not feel entirely comfortable that night. Someone would later recall that she seemed nervous about going to the mall alone, that she had mentioned feeling like she might be followed. But those details only seemed important in hindsight. As the evening dragged toward closing time, the bright lights inside the mall began to dim. Gates rolled down in front of stores. Staff wiped down counters and locked doors. Around 10 at night, Westdale Mall closed. Outside, it was fully dark, the kind of ink-black December sky that seems to swallow sound. The air was cuttingly cold. This was Iowa in winter. Breath curled in front of faces. Car engines coughed and sputtered as people hurried to start them and get the heat going. Michelle walked out into that cold, dark parking lot toward her car, a tan and green Buick belonging to her parents. She had parked some distance from the doors, out in the general sea of cars. It was the kind of spot you barely think about on a normal night. She reached the Buick, got in, and shut the door, Maybe she started the engine. Maybe she turned on the heater and watched as the windshield began to slowly clear from a frosty blur to something she could see through. It is likely she thought she was about to drive home, put down her purse, and tell her parents about her night. She never made it back. Someone approached that car in the darkness. The person opened the driver's door, pushed Michelle across toward the passenger side, and climbed in beside her. What happened next was brutal, quick, and vicious. In the cramped front seat of that Buick, Michelle was stabbed again and again. She fought. Defensive wounds later found on her hands and arms told a story of someone who refused to just let it happen. By the time it was over, she had been stabbed roughly 29 times. Her blood soaked the interior of the car. The attack was savage and personal, the kind of rage you might expect from someone who knew her well, not from a stranger in the night. And then, just like that, the killer was gone. No one saw them leave. No one called in a suspicious scream. The car sat in that lot, surrounded by darkness and empty spaces, looking like any other vehicle abandoned after closing. At home, the Martinko family waited, then worried, then panicked. When Michelle did not walk through the door, her father started calling around. Friends said they had seen her at the mall banquet earlier, but no one knew where she was now. Hours went by. The fear hardened into something dense and shimmering. Finally, in the early morning hours, he reported her missing. Around 4 a.m, police found the Buick in the mall parking lot, parked in a corner near one of the department stores. When officers looked inside, they saw a sight that would haunt them for decades. Michelle's body was slumped over in the front seat. She was still dressed. Her purse was there. Her cash was still there. Nothing obvious had been stolen. There were no signs that she had been sexually assaulted, but the violence was unmistakable. At that moment, Cedar Rapids lost a sense of safety it had taken for granted. This was not a big city plagued by constant crime. This was a Midwestern town where people left doors unlocked and teenagers went to the mall at night without thinking twice. Suddenly, all of that felt naive. You are watching Disturbed Intent. Before we go any deeper into Michelle's story, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. It helps more people see these cases and keeps stories like Michelle's from being forgotten. News of the murder hit the community like a shockwave. Local television stations led with it. Newspapers carried her picture, that blonde hair and bright smile, next to headlines about a brutal killing in a mall parking lot. Parents looked at their own teenage daughters and imagined that blood-soaked car as if it were their own. In the Martinko home, the news did not just shatter their sense of safety, it shattered their world. Janelle, Michelle's older sister, remembered the phone call and the way everything turned unreal, like a nightmare you keep expecting to wake up from. When the reality would not relent, she and her husband could only hold each other and try to breathe through the weight of it. Their father, usually stoic, was angrier than anyone had ever seen him. Their mother, who had spent years believing she would never have a child before Michelle arrived, was broken in a way that words could not fully describe. They had called Michelle their miracle baby. Now that miracle had been taken away from them in the most senseless way imaginable, in a parking lot just before Christmas. From the very beginning, the sheer brutality of what happened inside that Buick dictated how investigators thought about the case. Michelle had been stabbed over and over again, primarily in the face and chest. There were defensive wounds, evidence of a struggle, but there were also details that suggested something else. No robbery, no sexual assault, no obvious motive that fit neatly into a box. For detectives in 1979, one possibility towered over the others. It looked personal. When an 18-year-old girl is murdered, the first place investigators usually look is close to home. Boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, family members, men who may have felt rejected, obsessed, or angry. The old line repeats itself in police stations across the world. It is always the boyfriend, the girlfriend, the husband, someone very close. Michelle's life, like many teenagers, had included relationships, flirtations, fallouts. One of those relationships would quickly become the focus of suspicion. His name was Andy Seidel. Andy had been Michelle's boyfriend for about 2 years. He was slightly older, a year ahead of her. The kind of guy her friends noticed immediately. A friend remembered seeing him roller skating when they first met him. A guy with a flashy sports car vibe, charming but intense. Over time, Michelle's friends started to pick up on something more troubling. Andy could be possessive. After Michelle broke off the relationship, friends said she did not want to be tied down, that she wanted to date and live like any other teenage girl. Andy did not seem to handle it well. He still wanted to know where she was, who she was with, who she might be dating next. He talked to her friends. He kept showing up. So when police learned that Andy had been at Westdale Mall the same night Michelle was killed, any lingering doubt about who to talk to first vanished. They brought him in for questioning. The problem in cases like this is that alibis can be tricky. Andy said he had gone home after the mall closed. His mother backed him up. To some people, that sounded like exactly the kind of convenient alibi an overprotective parent might give a son who had gotten himself into serious trouble. To others, it sounded perfectly plausible. Police also talked to another young man in Michelle's life, an ex-boyfriend named Mike, who had dated her before heading off to college in another city. Mike was more than 100 miles away on the night of the murder, but that did not stop investigators from giving him a hard, detailed interview. At one point, when they believed he might be holding something back, they laid the crime scene photos out in front of him, forcing him to look at what had been done to someone he had cared about. He was cleared, geographically and forensically. He had not been in Cedar Rapids that night. Andy, though, lived under a cloud, people whispered. Some classmates were convinced he had done it. They remembered how intense he had been, how devastated he looked at Michelle's funeral. At that funeral, one scene burned itself into people's memories. Andy leaning into the casket, sobbing, arms around Michelle as if he could somehow pull her back. He was distraught, repeating that he needed to know who she had loved when she died. Had she loved him? Had she loved Mike? In his grief, he fixated on that question, as if the answer could change anything now. To some, that scene was a portrait of a young man destroyed by loss. To others, it looked like the dramatics of someone who knew he had caused it. But suspicion is not proof. And as investigators dug into Andy's life, they found no hard evidence tying him to the murder. No blood, no weapon, no confession. Beyond Michelle's inner circle, detectives also considered the possibility that she had been killed by a stranger. After all, she had gone to the mall alone, at night, with a significant amount of cash. She had been looking at a coat on layaway, walking through stores, talking with people. A predator who frequented the mall could easily have noticed her. There were hints that supported this theory. She had mentioned being nervous about going to the mall by herself. She had talked about feeling like someone might be following her. If a stranger had targeted her, maybe the attack started as a planned robbery or assault and spiraled into a frenzied killing when she fought back. But again, the details fought the theory. Her cash was still in her purse. Her shopping bags were untouched. There was no sexual assault. It was as if the killer had come specifically to hurt Michelle and then vanished back into the dark, leaving everything else behind. Inside the car, investigators did find something intriguing. Faint impressions that suggested the killer might have been wearing rubber or latex gloves. There were no usable fingerprints, despite the amount of blood. Whoever had done this had likely tried to conceal their identity. Even in 1979, that detail suggested someone who had thought at least a little about forensics and trace evidence. Outside, there were no cameras pointed at the lot, no surveillance to roll back. There were no witnesses who clearly saw someone approach her car. There were vague reports, people who thought they might have seen something, but nothing that tied to a specific face or name in a way that could hold up in court. The case quickly became a maze of interviews, rumors, and dead ends. Detectives put in long hours, going over timelines, talking to anyone who had been at Westdale that night. Hundreds of people were interviewed. Psychics, back when that was still a thing investigators occasionally entertained, offered their visions. None of it led to an arrest. As the year turned, the story of Michelle's murder stayed alive in Cedar Rapids. Each December, local news stations reminded viewers of the teenager killed just before Christmas in the mall parking lot. The case began to haunt the community, the way unsolved cases do. Parents brought it up as cautionary tales. Teenagers parked at malls felt a prickle on the back of their necks walking alone at night. But inside the police department, reality was harsher. Leads thinned out. Tips dried up. Forensic science in the early 1980s did not offer the kind of answers DNA would someday give. Eventually, the investigation slowed until, in practical terms, it stopped. The case went cold. For Michelle's family, that word was almost worse than murder. Cold meant nothing was happening. Cold meant the file was aging in a cabinet. Cold meant the person who had killed their daughter had moved on, gotten away with it, maybe even started another life in another town. Her sister Janelle remembered feeling like they had hit a wall. Everyone they could think of had been looked at. Every lead they had heard about had been followed. There was a point where it seemed like the investigation was simply dead in the water. Years turned into decades. The city changed. Westdale Mall, once shiny and new, aged and evolved. The teenagers who had known Michelle grew up, moved away, had families of their own. But every December 19th, her face still popped up on local news. A reminder that somewhere out there, someone had gotten into a car with an 18-year-old girl and stabbed her to death, and no one had been held responsible. Then, in the mid-2000s, science caught up to the murder of 1979. By that time, DNA analysis had become one of the most powerful tools in law enforcement. Cold cases around the country were being pulled from file cabinets and re-examined, not because detectives suddenly had new suspects, but because old evidence could now speak in new ways. In Cedar Rapids, one of the people who could not get Michelle's case out of his mind was a detective named Doug Larison. He had gone to high school with Michelle. They were not close, but her murder had shaken his graduating class. For him, reopening the file was not just another assignment, it was personal. He dove into the old reports, thousands of pages thick. Somewhere in that paper mountain, he found something that others had missed or simply never followed up on. At some point, a previous investigator had scraped dried blood from the gear shift of Michelle's car and sent it to a lab. For whatever reason, backlog, turnover, lack of communication, the results had just been filed away. When Larison dug out that report, he realized what it meant. The lab had been able to pull DNA from that dried blood, not Michelle's DNA. A male profile. That suggested something chilling and hopeful at the same time. During the attack, the killer had probably cut himself, his blood mixing with hers on the gearshift as he moved through that violent struggle. Amid all the horror, he had left part of his identity behind. Larison did not stop there. He sent Michelle's dress, which had been carefully stored in the evidence room for decades, to be tested as well. The lab found another small bloodstain with the same male DNA profile. Two separate items, same unknown man. Common sense screamed the obvious. This was likely their killer. Now, the challenge was to put a name to that genetic ghost. Detectives entered the male profile into CODIS, the national database that compares DNA from crime scene evidence to samples taken from convicted offenders. It was the long shot of all long shots, but sometimes those pay off. This time, they did not. The system came back with nothing. Whoever this man was, he had apparently never been convicted of a crime that required his DNA to be in the database, at least not yet. So investigators turned to the next logical step. They started collecting DNA samples from people connected to the case. They swabbed more than 100 men over the years. Old boyfriends, classmates, men who had been investigated back in the 1980s, people who had intersected with Michelle's life in any way that could possibly matter. They lined up their DNA profiles against the unknown male. One by one, the men were eliminated. One of those men was Andy Seidel. By then, Andy had lived for nearly 3 decades with a shadow over his name. In some corners of Cedar Rapids, people still whispered that he had killed his high school girlfriend and simply never been caught. That kind of suspicion has a way of sticking, no matter how much time passes. When detectives approached him, they made it simple. If you give us a DNA sample and it does not match, you are cleared. You can finally walk away from this cloud. Andy agreed. His DNA did not match the profile. He was eliminated as a suspect. Ironically, Michelle's parents never lived to hear that. They both died before the science could clear the young man they might have spent years privately blaming. In a bitter twist, Andy himself became a kind of victim of the crime, not in the same way Michelle was, but in the sense that his life was distorted by an accusation that never turned into a charge. As more men were tested and crossed off the list, years continued to pass. For Doug Larison, the emotional and mental toll of going down one dead end after another eventually wore him down. After about a decade of pushing the case forward, he told his supervisors it might be time for someone else to take the lead. That someone else would bring fresh eyes and a new kind of science to the hunt for Michelle's killer. When Detective Matt Denlinger stepped into the lead role on the Martinko case, The story had already spanned generations. For him, it was literally a family legacy. Matt's father, Harvey, had been one of the original detectives called out on that freezing December morning when Michelle's body was found. He had stared into that blood-stained car, walked that parking lot, and spent the early years chasing leads that went nowhere. Now, decades later, his son was taking over the same file. Every December 19th, Matt had grown up seeing Michelle's picture on the local news, hearing anchors retell the story of the high school senior who never made it home. The case was part of the local folklore of fear, the way some communities pass down stories of unsolved crimes like ghost tales with real victims. To Matt, solving it was not just professional, it was personal, and it was a chance to close a loop his father had been forced to leave open. By the mid-2010s, DNA technology had taken yet another leap. It was no longer just about matching biological samples to known offenders in CODIS. New companies were experimenting with something that sounded almost like science fiction, using DNA to predict what a person might look like. Matt reached out to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, a company on the cutting edge of what they called snapshot DNA phenotyping. He sent them the unknown male profile from the Martinko case and asked the kind of question detectives everywhere were starting to ask. Can you tell us anything more about this man, just from his DNA? The answer came back stranger and more hopeful than he expected. Parabon analyzed the profile and generated composite images, essentially computer-rendered faces of what the suspect might look like. They predicted that Michelle's killer was likely a white male with light features, possibly blonde hair and blue eyes. They provided multiple age-progressed versions, imagining him as a younger man around the time of the murder and as an older man decades later. The pictures were eerie, in a way only technology can make them. They were not photographs, but they were detailed enough to feel uncomfortably specific. Cedar Rapids police held a press conference and released the images to the public. They asked anyone who recognized the face, or who thought it looked like someone they knew in 1979, to call in a tip. The phones lit up. When you show a composite of a generically handsome white man with light hair and eyes, you end up hearing about almost every blonde, blue-eyed guy who ever lived in the area. Tips poured in. People saw old boyfriends, former neighbors, men from church, random customers. Each call represented a tiny sliver of hope and a huge amount of work. Matt and his colleagues chased hundreds of these leads. None of them led to the man whose blood was on Michelle's dress. At that point, it would have been easy to feel like they were back where they started. They had a face, sort of. They had DNA, but they still did not have a name. Then, in another state, a different case blew open and changed everything. In California, investigators arrested a retired police officer named Joseph D'Angelo, whom the public would soon know as the Golden State Killer. He was accused of a series of rapes and murders stretching back to the 1970s and 1980s. What stunned the world was not just the scale of his alleged crimes, but how they found him. They had used genetic genealogy. Instead of waiting for D'Angelo's DNA to appear in CODIS, investigators had uploaded crime scene DNA to a public genealogy website, looking not for an exact match, but for relatives. From there, genealogists built out family trees until they narrowed in on one man whose DNA secretly collected from discarded items matched the killer's profile. When Matt read about that, something clicked. If genetic genealogy could unmask a serial predator on the West Coast, maybe it could finally name the man who had killed an 18-year-old girl in an Iowa mall parking lot. He went back to Parabon, who were now offering exactly that kind of service. They took the same DNA profile they had used to build the composite images and prepared it for an upload to a public database called GEDmatch, a site where ordinary people had voluntarily shared their genetic data in the hopes of finding relatives or exploring their ancestry. The idea was simple and wildly complex at the same time. Find people in the database who shared enough DNA with the unknown profile to be related cousins. Perhaps then build backward, constructing family trees that could eventually point down to a single living person. Months crawled by. In the summer of 2018, Parabon contacted Matt with news. They had found a promising hit. A woman named Brandy, living in Washington State, identified as a distant cousin of the unknown male whose DNA had been found in Michelle's car. She was not the suspect, but she was a starting point. From there, the work looked less like a traditional police investigation and more like an obsessive genealogy project. Matt and the genealogists started digging into public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, census reports, gravestones. They traced family branches back to great-great-grandparents, then forward again through multiple lines of descendants. What emerged was a sprawling family tree. Most of its branches could be quietly ruled out as lines leading to women, people who were too young or too old, or individuals with strong alibis. But one branch eventually narrowed to a striking possibility: 3 brothers from Iowa. All 3 were white men. All 3 had been the right approximate age at the time of the murder. All 3 shared enough DNA with Brandy, the Washington cousin, that they could theoretically be the unknown male whose blood had ended up on Michelle's dress. Their names were Donald, Kenneth, and Jerry Burns. None of them had ever been on the radar in the original investigation. They were not ex-boyfriends, not co-workers, not family friends. As far as detectives could tell at first, they had no obvious connection to Michelle at all. That, in itself, was unnerving. For decades, the community had assumed the killer had to be someone in the circle: a jealous boyfriend, a resentful acquaintance, a man who could not stand being told no. Now, the science was pointing at a stranger. Of course, pointing is not proof. To move from theory to evidence, Matt and his colleagues needed one more thing: actual DNA from the brothers. They could not simply walk into their homes and demand it, at least, not yet. So they did what investigators in genetic genealogy cases around the country were starting to do. They followed them, quietly, and waited for them to throw something away. With one brother, they watched as he went out to lunch. When he finished his drink and left his straw behind, they collected it from the trash. For another, they retrieved a toothbrush from garbage left at the curb. Each item went off to the lab to be compared against the unknown profile from 1979. Nothing matched. Then there was the third brother. His name was Jerry. Matt drove up to Manchester, Iowa, a small city where Jerry lived and ran a business. For hours, the detectives watched and waited, tracking his movements. Finally, they saw him sitting inside a local pizza place, drinking soda from a glass with a straw. Jerry finished his drinks. He left. The detectives went in and collected the straws he had used. At the lab, Jerry's DNA profile lined up with the unknown blood from the gear shift and the dress like 2 pieces of the same key. It was a match. When Matt got the call confirming that, he was momentarily speechless. Decades of dead ends had led here, to a man whose name had never appeared in the original reports, whose connection to Michelle was, as far as anyone knew, non-existent. The next step was as much psychological as procedural. They had to confront Jerry with the evidence, not only to serve a warrant, but also to see what he would say. Matt chose a very particular day. On December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years to the day after the murder, he and other officers walked into Jerry Burns' business in Manchester. The date was no accident. Matt wanted that echo, that sense of time folding over itself. He also wanted to rattle Jerry, to see if the significance of the day would register. They told him who they were. They told him they were investigating the old Martinko case. They asked if he would talk. The entire conversation was recorded on a hidden camera disguised as a coffee mug. At first, it was polite, almost mundane. Matt asked about Jerry's life, his family, where he had been over the years. Jerry acknowledged that he had been to Westdale Mall in the past with his family. He could not or would not say exactly when. Then, Matt put the truth on the table. He told Jerry point blank that his DNA had been found at the crime scene, that they had his blood from Michelle's dress and from the interior of the car, that this was not speculation or rumor, it was science. Over and over, Jerry responded with some version of the same line: that he did not know how his DNA would have gotten there. He did not offer a memory, a confession, or even a far-fetched story. He did not say, "I have never hurt anyone in my life." He did not, according to Matt, plainly deny killing Michelle. For a homicide detective, that kind of silence can be as revealing as any statement. Before the interview ended, officers served Jerry with a search warrant, compelling him to provide an official DNA sample, this time taken directly, rather than from a discarded straw. The lab results confirmed what they already knew. The profile matched. Again. Jerry Burns was arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder in the death of Michelle Martinko. On the drive back to Cedar Rapids, with a camera rolling in the patrol car, Jerry made comments about traumatic events, about how people sometimes block things out, how memories can be buried. To Matt, listening to those words through the filter of everything he already knew, it sounded like something more than philosophical musing. For Michelle's sister Janelle, the call that came next was unlike any she had ever expected to receive. After nearly 4 decades, the police were telling her they had a name, a man, and scientific proof tying him to the blood inside her sister's car. She and her husband reacted with the joy and disbelief of people who had been told for years that this might never happen. They cheered, they cried, they talked over each other. After so long living with "we do not know," finally, there was an answer. But for Jerry's family, it was like a bomb went off in the middle of their ordinary lives. To them, Jerry was a husband, a father, a brother, a man who went to work, provided for his kids, attended family events. He had no criminal record. He was not known for violence. The idea that he could have snuck away one winter night in 1979, driven to a mall, pulled a teenager into a murder scene inside a car, and then gone home to sleep as if nothing had happened felt impossible. His daughter, Jennifer, and his brother Don would later insist that there was simply no way Jerry could have done what he was accused of. In their eyes, the man in handcuffs bore no resemblance to the monster who had slaughtered an 18-year-old girl. The rest of the story would not play out in a mall parking lot or an interrogation room. It would unfold in a courtroom, 40 years after Michelle's life was taken. By the time Jerry Burns went to trial in early 2020, Michelle's case had become part of the DNA of Cedar Rapids itself. Nearly everyone in town who had lived there in the late 1970s knew her name. Many younger residents had grown up seeing her photograph on the news every December, hearing adults talk about that girl at the mall. Because of that, there was almost no chance of seating an impartial jury in the city where she had died. The judge agreed to move the trial about an hour away, to Davenport, Iowa. In that courtroom, the prosecution carried the weight of 4 decades of fear, grief, and expectation. But they also faced serious challenges. They had no murder weapon, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses who could put Jerry at Westdale Mall that night, no surveillance video, no confession. What they had was DNA, a microscopic bridge between 1979 and the present, and a story built entirely from the way science, persistence, and a drop of blood could cross that bridge. Prosecutor Nick Maybanks stood before the jury and told them, plainly, that Michelle had been murdered by the man sitting at the defense table. He reminded them that the unknown male whose blood had been found on her dress and inside her car could belong to only one person in the world with those exact genetic markers, and that repeated testing had shown that person was Jerry Burns. He also framed the crime as what it appeared to be, a random act of violence by a stranger, not a jealous boyfriend, not a family acquaintance. In some ways, that made it more frightening. If a stranger could do this, then nearly anyone could cross paths with that kind of darkness. Michelle's old friends took the stand, their faces older, but their memories sharp in certain places. Tracy, who had sung in choir with her and seen her at the mall that last night, spoke about the shock that rolled through their class the next morning. Mike, the ex-boyfriend who had once been a suspect, relived not only his grief, but the way detectives had confronted him with crime scene photos decades earlier. Even Andy, the boyfriend who had lived under suspicion for so long, testified, talking about his relationship with Michelle and making clear that their breakup was not filled with violent conflict, just the drift that comes when teenagers grow into different people. For all of them, the trial reopened wounds they had spent years trying to let scar over. But it also offered something they had never had before, a chance to look at someone in a courtroom and hear the word "accused" attached to him with evidence behind it. On the other side of the courtroom, Jerry's attorney, Leon, had to do something very specific: introduce doubt. He did not argue that the DNA found in the car and on the dress belonged to someone else. The science was too strong. Instead, he tried to convince the jury that there were other explanations for how Jerry's DNA might have gotten there. A forensic consultant testified for the defense, talking about secondary transfer, the idea that DNA can move from person to person, surface to surface, without direct contact. He floated the possibility that Michelle and Jerry could have both been at the mall, maybe touched the same surface in the food court or brushed past each other, and that some trace of Jerry's genetic material had eventually found its way into her car or onto her clothing. Don, Jerry's brother, suggested another scenario, that Jerry had worked at a dealership that sold Buicks, and that perhaps his DNA had ended up in a car that was later sold to Michelle's family. It was a theory that sounded more like a thought experiment than a concrete memory. But in a trial, even hypothetical routes can carry weight if they suggest reasonable doubt. The prosecution pushed back hard. They pointed out that while stray skin cells might transfer in random ways, the blood on Michelle's dress and on the gear shift inside the car was in the form of clear stains mixed in with her own blood, the kind of thing you expect when two people are locked in a violent struggle in a very small space. The idea that such blood had somehow hopped from a dealership floor to a teenage girl's clothing without direct contact strained credulity. They also reminded the jury of the way Jerry had responded when confronted with the DNA evidence, not with a firm denial or even anger at the accusation, but with evasive comments about not knowing how it could have gotten there and musings about people blocking out traumatic events. Then there was the testimony of a man named Michael, a jailhouse acquaintance of Jerry's. Michael had met Jerry while they were both in custody. He testified that when he had asked Jerry directly whether he had committed the crime, Jerry had responded that he could not talk about it. He said Jerry had told him that no matter what happened, he felt he had already won because he had been able to live free with his family for all those years. At one point, during a card game, Jerry allegedly joked that if Michael kept beating him, he might have to take him to the mall. Given what had happened in that mall parking lot in 1979, that comment landed in the courtroom like ice water. To some, it sounded like an off-color, tasteless remark from a man under enormous stress. To others, it sounded like someone who could not help letting the truth leak out sideways. In his closing argument, Leon hammered away at the idea that the state's story required too many leaps. He painted a picture of an ordinary family man with two young children at home back in 1979, supposedly leaving his house in the night with gloves and a knife, driving to Cedar Rapids on the off chance he would encounter a specific 18-year-old girl at a mall, killing her in a parked car, then driving home covered in blood without leaving a trace that anyone noticed. He asked the jurors to consider whether that really sounded like the life of the man his family described, or whether the state had become so focused on the DNA match that it had ignored everything else. Maybanks, for the prosecution, ended where he had begun, with the science and with Michelle. He reminded the jury that Michelle had fought hard enough to cause her attacker to injure himself, that her fight had drawn his blood, literally, onto her clothing and her car, that those stains had sat quietly in an evidence locker for almost 40 years, waiting for technology to catch up. He told them that this was not a case about bad luck or contamination or coincidence. It was a case about a man whose blood had been found in all the places you would expect the killer's blood to be, and nowhere else. A man who could not give a plausible explanation for that. A man whose DNA, like a fingerprint written in code, unlocked a mystery that had tormented a community for decades. Then, the case went to the jury. For the people who had waited so long, the hours that followed felt almost surreal. Some expected days of deliberation, long nights of wondering whether 4 decades of work would end in a verdict or in a hung jury that would force everyone to start over. Instead, after only a few hours, the court staff said they had reached a decision. In the courtroom, Michelle's friends and family filled the benches, hearts pounding. On the other side, Jerry's relatives sat stiff and silent. Detectives and lawyers who had lived with this case for years took their seats and tried to steady themselves. The jury filed in. The foreperson stood. They found Jerry Lynn Burns guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Michelle Martinko. In that moment, in that room, the weight of 40 years seemed to drop just a little. Janelle described the silence, the way no one on Jerry's side reacted, the way she and her husband felt themselves breathing again for the first time in years. There was no cheering, not in that solemn space, but there was relief like a tide. For Jerry's family, the verdict felt like a nightmare solidified into something permanent. They remained convinced that the man they knew could not have done what the state said he had done. To them, the science was being twisted, the story bent. They talked about appealing, about fighting on. The judge would later sentence Jerry to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory punishment for first-degree murder. Appeals were filed and rejected. The conviction stood, but even with the verdict, some questions lingered in the background. During his interview with Matt, Jerry had casually mentioned the name of another woman, a blonde television news anchor from Iowa, who had vanished years after Michelle, abducted near her car in a parking lot and never found. There is no evidence that Jerry was involved in that disappearance. His DNA has not been linked to any other crime. Law enforcement has not publicly tied him to additional cases. Still, the shadow of possibility is hard to shake. When someone can commit one act of violence like that and live a seemingly ordinary life for decades, it is natural to wonder whether there were other nights, other parking lots, other victims whose stories have not yet found their way to justice. What we know for certain is this: in Michelle's case, she played a crucial role in exposing the person who killed her. By fighting back in that car, she forced him into a struggle intense enough that he wounded himself. His blood mixed with hers. It stained her dress and the gear shift of the Buick. Those stains sat silently through the 80s, the 90s, and beyond, until DNA and then genetic genealogy gave them a voice. In a way that feels both heartbreaking and powerful, Michelle helped solve her own murder. Decades after her death, friends, family, and investigators gathered not just to talk about how she was killed, but about how she lived. They swapped stories about her hair, her sense of style, the way she doted on her dog, the shyness under the glamour, the miracle baby who had come into a family that thought it might never hear a child's laughter again. Her name will always be tied to one of Cedar Rapids' most haunting crimes. But thanks to the detectives who would not let go, the scientists pushing the limits of DNA, and the fight she put up in her final moments, her story is also tied to something else. The idea that even when time seems to bury the truth has a way of pushing back. You have been watching Disturbed Intent. If you are still here with me, please take a second to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Tell me in the comments what you think about the use of genetic genealogy in cold cases like this one. Do you believe it is the future of solving long-buried crimes, or are there lines we should not cross? Thank you for spending your time honoring Michelle's memory with me today. Stay safe, stay aware, and I will see you in the next case.